2 weekends ago, I read this book, Story of a Poem by Matthew Zapruder. And you have here some excerpts from the book, which we'll get to in a second, on page 4 of the daf. And I exchanged emails with Matthew this past week or a week and a half ago after I read the book, which I found deep and profound. And it got me thinking about prayer, because our prayer book is all poetry. So I want to begin by telling a very shortened version of a story from this old religious school textbook called When a Jew Prays. Maybe some of you are familiar with this textbook of When a Jew Prays, but on about page 10 or 11 of the book, towards the book, there's a story, and it's a story that in a number of ways makes no sense, and I won't bother to describe to you how it makes no sense. You can just decide for yourself, but I find it a very, very provocative story. Two Polish nobles are having a discussion, noble men, noble people, and one of them is bragging about their beautiful white stallion that is the greatest racehorse in the county, I don't know if they have counties in medieval Poland, but we'll pretend they did. And his horse can do all kinds of things. And the other Polish noble person says, "Oh, you may have the greatest racehorse in the county, but in my county lives the wisest rabbi of any place." Now, why a Polish nobleman would have any kind of positive relationship with the wisest rabbi, the story doesn't go into, but we will ignore that. And so these two Polish noblemen are arguing about which is greater, the great white racehorse or the wisdom of the rabbi. And so they make a bet, and the story becomes more and more absurd, but there is a point. They make a bet. "I'll bet your wise rabbi is not smart enough to teach my great horse how to pray." Says, "Of course my wise rabbi can teach your horse how to pray," and they make a bet. I don't know what the bet is, but $100, $1,000, I don't know what kind of whatever. And so the horse is brought over to the yard of the noble who has the rabbi, who's his buddy, and he says to the rabbi, "Now you have 2 weeks to teach this horse to pray, and I will win $1 million, and I'll give you 10%. The rabbi says, "Okay." So Rabbi takes the horse, and the first day the horse is over there. He takes a prayer book, and he opens up the prayer book, and he puts some oats on the page of the prayer book and leads the horse over. The horse sees the oats, licks them, and it's great. Day 2, Rabbi prepares the prayer book, puts oats on the first page, turns the page, puts oats on the second page, brings the horse in, eats the oats, flips with his tongue, I can smell more, eats the next oats, and so it goes for days 3, 4, 5. Every day the rabbi flips one more page, puts more oats on the page. So at the end of 14 days, the horse, of course, knows the trick and is flipping through the prayer book. And so after that, Noble 1 comes to Noble 2. Here, come see what's going to go on. And sure enough, they bring in, but this time the rabbi puts no oats on the page, but the horse, the whole thing. It's like Pavlov. So the horse goes in, no oats on the first page, but he flicks the second page, flicks the third page. "My God, you've taught my horse to read. Here's your $1 million, the end." Now, I thought about that story. I read that story when I was teaching religious school at the age of, 24 in rabbinical school, and now I'm 71 years old, and I've been thinking about that story for 47 years because I find it profound. The reason I found it profound, and I once said this to our beloved teacher, Rabbi Hoffman, the story invites the question, what is prayer? What is prayer? Is prayer turning the pages in a book and kind of go through it? And at the same time, I was studying in rabbinical school, and it slowly dawned on me that everybody around me knew what prayer was, and I wasn't sure what prayer was. Every day there was daily Beis Medrash. You'd walk in, pick up a prayer book, and at some point, I began teaching this prayer book when I was in the second year of rabbinical. So by the time I was in fourth or fifth year, I realized I may be like the horse. I don't know. It's a deep thing, and by then I learned the history of every prayer. I learned the author of every prayer. I learned the original source of every prayer. This one comes from this one comes from this. And then the Italian Nusach met the Sephardic Nusach, and there's a later version. But what is the experience of prayer? So, and they're not teaching that in rabbinical school. You have to you learn the history, you learn the literature, but what is prayer supposed to be about? So, in terms of what is taught in prayer, I decided, and I came across this reading some sociology, that prayer is identity formation. And that's for certainly what we do with prayer education with children. We teach Hebrew, we teach trope, we teach melodies, and so we teach what we think Jews pray like. So when a person walks into a synagogue, they are acting out simply by holding the prayer book, holding the Hebrew, holding the book that goes from right to left. They are affirming an identity as a Jew. It's an act of identity formation, identity reinforcement. That's what it is. It is, in terms of identity reinforcement, identity formation, identity deepening, it is the kind of activity that caused Marshall Sclair, the first sociologist, PhD in sociology at the University of Chicago, to study American Jewish life seriously as an academic sociologist. He was the one that called in the 1950s the conservative movement synagogue an ethnic church. Because what prayer was, you were learning the skills to affirm and act out ethnic identity. So that for sure is part of what prayer is. And I think in many, many ways, you could say that is a large part of what prayer is in any place. And it's not unimportant, because we want to know who we are. Knowing who we are is part of it, because we also want to understand what we are is about. And so I think it was the reformers going back to 18th century, 19th century in Germany also thought there is a part of prayer, that prayer has a liturgical message. And so they began to reform the prayers. They took out phrases that they could morally disagreed with. They translated the prayer book from Hebrew into German, and then here in English, so people could understand what the prayers meant, so that a liturgical message could start to come through. But even when the prayers are translated, we have this obstacle because, as I pointed out before, a prayer that's written 400 years ago in one context, the translation doesn't do it, because you're still reading something as foreign just because it's English, let alone the fact that all these prayers are poems. And how do you understand a poem, so to speak, on the fly? When anybody has a book of poetry at home, they're reading it slowly, trying to figure out. Sometimes you have to read it aloud because a poem has a cadence. So prayer is identity formation, and it's a liturgical message. And then the words of prayer present, as I said, a kind of complication, because it's an art form, and sitting in a room requires interpretation. The musical interpretation has to somehow kind of capture what the prayer wants to be about. And so poetry itself it requires a different kind of understanding. What I wrote down here, poetry requires a kind of intuitive understanding, that it's that the prayer is somehow coming to you, coming into your sense in terms of, I intuit what this poet is trying to say. So it just so happened that the weekend after I read this book last weekend, Liberalism is a Way of Life. And in this book, Liberalism is a Way of Life, I come across this fantastic sentence. On receiving the Nobel Prize in 2017, novelist Kazuo Ishiguro, who I'd never heard of, but my smart wife knows Kazuo Ishiguro, and so in his speech, he said this about his craft of writing a novel. This is a brilliant, I don't want to say it, I don't want to prejudge. This is a quote. This is a quote from his Nobel Prize speech. In the end, stories are about one person saying to another, "This is the way it feels to me. Can you understand what I'm saying? Does it also feel this way to you?" I think that's what's going on in a prayer book. The person who wrote the prayer had a certain feeling about something that they put down maybe on parchment and appears to us 1,000 years later, 1,500 years later, and the poet is saying, this is the way it feels to me. It feels to me the way that so much that I wrote it down. And it felt to someone else so much that they put it in the prayer book. And then someone else put it so much that they translated it because they grabbed it. But we're now 1,000 years, 1,500 years later. Can you understand what I'm saying? Did it feel this way to you? Well, I don't know, because it's hard for me to understand what you're feeling. This is the huge challenge of prayer. This for me captures these two things together. Capture for me the huge challenge of what we're trying to do. And so now if you go to the text here on page 4, we'll kind of go through what Matthew Zapruder says and think of prayer as an art form, and we'll learn from this. Poetry, and whenever you see the word poetry here, just think of the word prayer, as if it's the word prayer. Poetry gives us the great gift of allowing us to forget momentarily that communicating is mostly functional. There's nothing functional about prayer. For me, imagination is synonymous with discovery. Poetry is like faith. It isn't meant to be understood, but to be received in a state of grace. And that's why the ambience of the room is so important. That's why it's so nice to be in a sanctuary. That's why it's so nice to have beautiful music, to be seduced to somehow feeling like we're in a state of grace so that something different can happen to us when we're together. And then, Keats' famous among poets formulation is that in order to write poetry, you have to be like Shakespeare, capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. That is so true of the prayer experience. If I wanted to, I can name you the people who will come up to me and say, "I don't agree with this prayer." Well, you have to leave any irritable reaching after fact and reason if you're going to go into the prayer experience, okay? And it's so hard. You have to allow yourself to be seduced, okay? Then, Aristotle wrote that poets are poets because they make metaphor. They are fitters. They put together things we think are strangers to each other. This makes them a danger to all authorities. Their profanity is holy, and on every word they write, they assert the possibility that we can cross between new worlds to make new meaning. I think that's what people, in terms of this, I like this because this is what people who put together prayer books are trying to do. They are fitters. The people who put together this prayer book are fitters. They're trying to take the language and the poetry of one age and make it work for our age. And what they're doing, in a sense, there's a profanity to it because they're ripping apart the old prayer thing and putting it in here. and they assert the possibility that we can cross between new worlds to make new meaning. So what the prayer means to us is for sure not the same. It can't be the same. It can't be the same of what it meant to the person who was singing this song on a hillside in Sfat, in a world, in a place that conceived the entire world differently. And then poetry is the way we help give name to the nameless so that it can be thought. And when I read that, writes Audre Lorde, and when I read that, I just grabbed this quote of Richard Rorty, who I read from so often in these remarks. A talent for speaking differently rather than for arguing well is the chief instrument of cultural change. It's to give name to the nameless so it can be thought. That's what a poem, that's what a prayer is trying to do, to bring you into a different world. That it's not deductive reasoning, that this is going to lead to this, is going to lead to this, is going to lead to this. It's aha. It's like, when I read this, and I say this very haltingly because I'm scared, it's like when the person pulls a rabbit out of a hat. It's an aha moment, okay? Don't think of prayer as magic, but this notion that you're willing to go along with the magician, knowing that the hat isn't the hat, the rabbit isn't the rabbit, but this is what requires kind of a suspension of disbelief. Is that what it is? Okay. And then I just took this last one because I liked it. All poets are as Jews are to everyone else, wandering the earth, looking for a home, linked only by the book and the primal myths written in it. They are by nature exiles from the society in which they live, connected far more to each other than to their fellow citizens by language and books, an allegiance deeper and more lasting than mere nationality. Okay? We're connected because of our books, because of our literature, because of these what's inherited here. Poets are strangers to the dominant culture, uneasy guests. As much as we might love words, we are also deeply skeptical of them, need to constantly examine and worry away at the very way of speaking that others take for granted. That's me. That takes others for granted, that others take for granted. That's my typo, is we have to have. So I like that where he compares being a poet to being Jewish. I just thought there was something there. By nature, exiles from our society in which we live, connected to each other. So that's what happens in the summer. Ruminations on my recent reading.